Hello, this is Elizabeth Merritt, talking to you from the American Alliance of Museums. Thank you so much to Blackbaud for hosting our webinar today. We're going to be spending a scintillating hour looking at the future of museums, at scenarios, and in particular at the 2040 edition of Museum Magazine that came out last fall. I'm going to be joined today by Omar Eaton Martinez, and we'll be talking to our speakers more later, but just to give you a brief intro, Omar leads the Prince George's County Historical Resources and Historical House Museums, including the programming of those sites, and works on preserving, sustaining, and enhancing those resources. We'll also be joined by Kara Krmpotek, who is a museum anthropologist committed to decolonizing museum practices with particular attention to collections work. She has her master's in anthropology from the University of British Columbia and a DPhil from the University of Oxford. And both Kara and Omar are going to help me explore one particular theme that has arisen in our scenarios and forecasting, which is the issue of truth and reconciliation in museum practice. But before we have Kara and Omar join us, I wanted to back up and give you a general introduction to our 2018 trends work. In 2018, it is the 10th anniversary of the Center for the Future of Museums. Yay, we're so happy. And we have been publishing Trends Watch for 7 years now. This is our 7th edition. And in honor of the 10th anniversary of CFM, we're doing something a little bit different. So in previous years of Trends Watch, we've followed the format of picking 5 or 6 trends of what's going on out in the world, important things that are making a difference to society, that have implications for museums, and where we can point to specific examples of museum practice that is evolving around those trends. This year, with support of Blackbaud and our other sponsors, we're doing something a little bit different. And if you go to the Trends Watch 2018 landing page that we just launched last week, you can see the link here that you can copy and click on. You'll see that what we're doing this year is a scenario edition. Now, scenarios are simply stories of potential futures. Any of you who are familiar with the work of CFM knows that I say over and over again, futurists don't have the job of predicting the future. We have the job of helping people imagine alternative futures. And by exploring all the different ways that things could turn out, we help museums explore important situations, problems that exist now in the present, and figure out how they can organize their planning in resilient, adaptable ways that let them move forward and put multiple bets down on how things might turn out. One of the reasons the Alliance founded the center is we saw many excellent museums do strategic planning that ended up failing because they made assumptions about the way the world would be in 5 or 10 or 20 years, and those assumptions ended up being wrong. So by creating scenarios, we're helping museums broaden their thinking about the world they might live in as their plans play out. Now, other sectors have been using scenarios for years. So, for example, one of the earliest sets of scenarios from the business sector was from Shell Oil. They've been doing scenario planning for 40 years because it's very important for an industry like an oil business to say what happens when we reach peak oil. It's going to happen eventually. We don't know when. As a matter of fact, multiple times people have said it's going to be in the year 2000, it's going to be in the year 2010, and they've been wrong. But it's going to happen eventually. So it's very important for Shell to think about what they will be in a post-oil future. Are they going to pivot to sustainable energy? Are they going to pivot to energy distribution? And by creating and renewing these scenarios over the decades, they've helped guide their business planning very successfully. Scenarios have already been used in nonprofit work as well. There's a great scenario set that I've gone back to and over again that was created by the American Library Association, Scenarios on the Future of the Book. Now, those are a set of scenarios about a very specific question. In the future, will people continue to be using print, physical books? Will people be using digital books? Is it going to be one or the other or both? And they wrote a set of scenarios exploring how that could play out, because it's very important for library planning when you're thinking about the physical library and how it's designed, when you're thinking about training for future librarians, when you're thinking about allocation of resources. So that was a set of scenarios that helped libraries and library programs think of how the world could turn out and create flexible plans around each option. A set of scenarios that is in a museum-adjacent sector that I highly recommend to your attention was put out just last year by the KnowledgeWorks Foundation. KnowledgeWorks works on the future of American public education. And they put out on a report saying, all right, let's explore a lot of different ways that local school districts could adapt to all of the problems plaguing P through 12 education right now. So one scenario says, well, maybe one really visionary governor of a state steps forward and says, we're going to pool all our resources and integrate lots of different educational resources so that we have a resilient network to support local schools. And another school district might be saying, it's just going to have to be the parents and the local businesses pulling together to figure out how to create a good educational system. So they're not making predictions. They're not saying it's going to be this way or that way. In fact, these different scenarios might come true in different places across the U.S. But by reading how these things could play out, people can decide, what do we think would work for us? Are there ones we want to try and make true in our neighborhood and community? When organizations are using scenarios, you can ask questions like, what are our hopes for the future? Do we have a consensus about what a good future would look like? Who should we be talking to see if we all agree on that being the direction we would like to go? It helps you look at your underlying assumptions, those nasty assumptions that often derail unsuccessful plans, and question those. Do we really want to have a scenario where the museum is successful because we have hugely more space? Well, often when you're talking to donors, it's like, would you like to fund a new addition? The assumption is that more space is a successful future. That may not be true. So when you really critically think about what success looks like, it helps you define your values and set goals. It also lets you prepare for the things you hope don't happen. You can't map out every potential disaster or downturn, but by spending a little bit of time thinking about them, you have your staff prepared to jump in and deal with them without it being completely out of the blue if something bad happens. And most importantly, it helps you remain aware of the fact that one of the most important forces shaping the future is you, individually and organizationally, and how you allocate your resources. So when you are making your plans and writing your budget every year, you should be making intentional choices to put those resources to building the kind of future you want to live in. When we write a scenario, we're not just talking about what is a museum going to look like. Actually, we're talking about what is the world going to look like. But then given that world, you as readers can ask, what are the implications for museums? What would I or my family, my community, or my museum be doing to thrive under those circumstances? What can I or my organization do to either create that future if it sounds good, avert that future if it sounds like something you don't want to come to pass? So when I sat down to work with the field to create a scenario set for museums, I mapped out 4 basic scenario types to work on. One of them is a bright future. I asked museum people, if you really were going to write a happy vision of what the world was like for your museum to thrive, what would you say are really good things? Now, it's unlikely that all of those great things are going to come true, but when you spend some time living in that world in your head, first of all, you realize most things that you think are great aren't necessarily unalloyed goods. You probably have heard stories of people who won the lottery and then turned out not so well, because money doesn't really solve all our problems, and the same is true for museums. I also asked people to articulate all of their middle-of-the-night fears. What are the things that really haunt you? It would be terrible if. And it's dystopian. I admit they're a little fun to write, but the most important thing about those scenarios is by surfacing those fears and exposing them to daylight, you may find out they're not as scary as you think. Almost everything that could happen and go wrong can be dealt with in some way. And helping you think about that makes you more prepared to deal with it. We also did a very mainstream type of scenario called an equilibrium model, saying, let's just look at what's happening now, the trends shaping society as it is right now, technological trends, social trends, economic trends, political trends, project them forward into the future and say, where would we end up if we just keep going in that direction? Lastly, we're going to choose a wild card, some kind of low probability, high impact event, the kind of thing that can disrupt the best laid plans. Now, the wild card we look at in this scenario set might not be something that actually happens. It may not be the wild card you're most worried about. But by studying wild cards, it gets you in the habit of thinking about what kind of low probability, high impact events could be most important for your institution. It might be a 100-year flood, which are turning out to be more frequent than once every 100 years nowadays. It could be the loss of one major income stream. And again, by spending some time living with that and thinking about it, you can be better prepared to deal with that event should it come to pass. When I designed this scenario set and started framing it out, my thought was when I go to work with museums, when I give workshops at associations or in an individual museum, by sitting down with museum staff and doing exercises around each of these scenarios, by working through those kinds of discussion questions, I can help the staff and board and community members use these scenarios to frame their future thinking. So this is the kind of tool that the Center for the Future of Museums was founded to create for museums. This is our first time working on scenarios, and we've done it in a very iterative, experimental way. We started out last fall by working on the equilibrium scenario, that one that describes a future that could result from things just going in the direction they were already going. And looking at current trends and everything people are writing about mainstream projections. For example, we saw a world that's characterized by increased wealth inequality, that is shaped by the effects of climate change, and has continuing economic challenges from reductions in government funding and from changes in the focus and expectations for philanthropic funding. Having framed out that scenario, we shared it with a whole bunch of creative authors throughout the field, and we said, in face of all these challenges, museums have prospered. So in the year 2040, if it looked like this equilibrium scenario, what will museums have done to thrive in this future? You tell me what that looks like. And the result was the special edition of Museum Magazine, Museum 2040, which, by the way, won a major publishing award just last month. Yay! And we had people from all over the field contributing stories where, for example, they said, wow, maybe in the year 2040, museums are helping to de-extinct, to revive extinct species. Maybe we're celebrating the 20th anniversary of the diversity standards that were created and disseminated through the Alliance. Maybe museums are playing a major role in health and well-being, so there will be a lot of different museums operating well-being and cognitive health centers. So that kind of creative thinking then can lead people to go back and say, well, wait a minute, 2040, do we have to wait that long? What do we have to do? What can we get started now that will either make that happen sooner or ensure that this is true by the year 2040? If you haven't already seen that publication, it's a free download from the AAM website, and we've got a link here, so please get your copy and you can read it. You may already have taken a look, but we're going to start out today with a panel discussion on one of the very important issues that surfaced as we had our authors explore that potential future. And it arose because when we invited people to look at that future and say what might happen, Omar jumped in and said, I would like to think about the role that museums might be playing in truth and reconciliation in this mainstream future that you described. So, Omar, could you start by giving a brief introduction to yourself and your current work, and tell the audience where you are now, because you've actually switched jobs since you wrote this article for Museum 2040.
This is very true. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Elizabeth, again for giving me this assignment, and I'll dig into a little bit more why I'm thankful for this opportunity. But I am now the Assistant Division Chief for the Prince George's County Parks and Rec, which is part of the larger Maryland National Capital Parks and Planning Commission. So right now I help lead with some very strong colleagues of mine, the historic sites within Prince George's County. And so we help look at the interpretation, the education, the historic preservation, as well as digging into community involvement. And I don't think I've been here 2 months yet, so I'm not going to get too deep into the weeds about that right now because I know I have plenty to learn, but my colleagues here at the Commission have been extremely welcoming and extremely informative and extremely transparent in a way that I truly appreciate. But I did come from the Smithsonian National Museum of American History, where I was the Intern and Fellows Program Manager, and I also served on several committees internally that had to deal with diversity and inclusion, advocacy for African Americans and Latinos within the Smithsonian, and certainly had the pleasure to serve on the DEAI working group at the American Alliance of Museums, as well as other similar committees in some of the related sectors that do the work that we do. So I'm super happy to be a part of this conversation and really dig into this wonderful topic.
Thank you. And Omar, for those viewers who haven't read Museum 2040 yet, can you briefly summarize your article?
I'll try. First of all, I would like to say that, when Elizabeth introduced me to this opportunity, and I really had a very weak understanding what futurism is, and I'm so glad that she took the time in the first few slides to really dig into that and what scenarios meant, because I think like most people, when they see that word, they're thinking about, sci-fi, 200, 300, 400 years from now, Buck Rogers types of stuff. And that's what I was thinking. But I thought that once I spoke with you and also Nicole Ivy, you helped kind of frame it for me much better so that I can understand it as a tool. And I think that's what it really has become for me. It has become a tool. So when I started thinking about what could I write around social justice issues that pertains to 2040 and the context of the museum sector, I had just recently met a person who works at the University of Maryland who had really started digging into truth and reconciliation. The person was going through a leadership program, and really part of the leadership program dealt with the history of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. That's something that I've always sort of peripherally been interested in. I've kind of read a few articles on it, but I didn't really dig any deeper than that. But once I started to talk to her, I really saw how intimately it connected to my work as a professional, because what it really stands on is, number one, illuminating the truth. And as an educator, as a museum professional and public historian, that's what we want to do. We want to illuminate the truth. And illuminating the truth will allow us to then put us in a position where we can create safe spaces of dialogue to become reconciled. And so what an excellent way to kind of move forward with museum work. So then I started to gain a little bit more information about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, and then some of the efforts in Canada. And then, of course, I came across a lot of the like-minded work that Brian Stevenson has done and is doing at the Equal Justice Initiative with the 2 new museums and memorials that he opened up in Alabama just a couple of months ago. And I really started thinking, what does this mean for the near future of this country? Obviously, I think most would concur that the last 10 years, there has been some really deep thought, discussion, and contention around race, around other identities that have been subjugated and other identities that have been privileged. And so how am I going to think about this in a way that we can use museums as a conduit to kind of tear down those walls of hostility? And so thinking about the TRC and thinking about really, for me personally and my family and my kids and the type of world that I want my kids to inherit and to continue to build upon, like how the understanding that this was going to be done, 20 to 40 years out was really, really exciting me, because then I can incorporate what I really hope will be the type of world that my children will inherit as adults and will continue to build upon and improve. As you know, that as human beings, we're always sort of a work in progress.
What I really loved about your story was that really aspirational aspect. All of the lead articles in Museum 2040 stepped up to not only describe how museums are thriving in that future, the authors went beyond my original assignment and described how the world was a better place because of what museums were doing in that future. So you talked about truth and reconciliation. Sarah Sutton talked about museums helping lead green sustainability. Adam Roseanne talked about museums contributing to the community in very fundamental ways, including health and wellness. I also want to point out Omar is a great example of how jumping in early and often on CFM's work lets you invent your own personal futures. In Omar's chapter, I will note he made himself Secretary of the Smithsonian and his daughter is the President of the United States.
Well, you know how it is. What is the old saying? You got to reach the sun, you got to shoot for the stars.
There you go.
I just thought it was fun. It was a fun way to kind of. I'm always talking to people about creating a professional vision for themselves, and so this was just sort of part and parcel of what I've already been engaged with a lot of the work I did with the Smithsonian, what I hope to continue here at the Maryland National Capital Parks and Planning Commission.
Cool. Well, one of the great things about the edition of the magazine was even before it was published, it started spawning spin-off conversations. And one of those conversations was with Kara, who I met. Kara, I met you at the Ontario Museums Association?
That's right.
Yeah, and I told you about the article that Omar was working on, and you said, oh, I'm already working with museums who are contributing to Truth and Reconciliation in Canada. And I said, oh, please, will you write a post for the CFM blog about that so that we can begin expanding on and spinning off conversations? And indeed, you published a guest post called Fostering Truth and Reconciliation One Generation at a Time. Could you tell our listening audience a little bit more about you and your work and give them a synopsis about what you described in your blog post?
Sure. And just like Omar, I'd like to say thanks for this opportunity to both write the post but also be part of this webinar today. So I'm talking with everybody from the University of Toronto. I am director and a professor in the Museum Studies program here, which is a professional master's degree that seeks to build fluency across museum activities and histories, but also to critically and politically engage with best practice. And so often my students hear the question from me, best for whom and best for what? And we really want to help shape and advocate for emerging practices. So this idea of futurisms and futurities and scenarios is something that's quite dear to us. At the moment, I am currently serving the Great Lakes Research Alliance for the study of Aboriginal arts and cultures, which we shorten to GRASAC. And this is an alliance that spans communities, museums, and universities. It includes Indigenous and non-Indigenous members, students, artists, language teachers, curators, art historians, lawyers, musicologists. The thing that we share is a commitment to understanding the social, cultural, and political history of the many nations who are part of the lands and waters of the Great Lakes. And then we use that understanding to help us build a meaningful alliance. And that for us means an alliance that takes into account the long histories of Indigenous governance and alliance building in this area. So this work grows out of and is related to prior museum practice and perspectives that I've had that have really been shaped by a sustained research partnership with the Haida Repatriation Committee, an indigenous nation whose home's in the Pacific Northwest, and really trying to understand repatriation from their own cultural and historical perspectives. And I've also overseen a multi-year program for Cree and Anishinaabe seniors who live here in the city of Toronto, where we were able to satisfy their interest in material heritage and history by organizing artifact handling sessions, reminiscence sessions. We did crafting, and we did tons of behind-the-scenes museum visits, including the Smithsonian, national museums here in Canada, and institutions throughout the Greater Toronto Area.
So you actually had the advantage of having lived a little piece of this future because Canada is rather ahead of the U.S. in the process of formal truth and reconciliation, correct?
That is correct. So we have been through a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada, and it specifically addressed the forced removal of Indigenous children to what were called Indian residential schools. And the formal commission, the statement gathering and witnessing, closed in 2015, but a series of reports were produced, about 6 reports, as well as a number of calls to action for Canadians. And so we've got the URL here if any readers want to go and familiarize themselves with the report and the calls to action. Volume 6 in particular notes the role of museums and archives.
Super. And you wrote about that at some more length in your blog post, so readers can follow up on it there. Now, I know when I write something, I always wake up the next day thinking, darn, I wished I'd said that, or I could have added this other thing. So, Omar, so particularly with respect to your article, if you had the chance to write it again, are there things you would have changed?
Definitely. Since I've written the article, I've continued to to learn more about the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. I started to learn a little more about Kara's work and other people that have done this, either on the political side or the museum, arts, and culture side. And one of the things that I would have liked to spend more time on is the idea of reparation. Because reparations, if you look at the actual word, it is to restore and to repair, to bring back whole again. And so when you're talking about truth and reconciliation, what you want to do with this is you want to create a space, create a society where people can speak intimately to each other about their differences to gain common ground. That's why in the article it was kind of cool to be able to kind of dig into slightly futuristic technologies in terms of what I wrote about called power winds, which was to take a walk in my shoes, and to be able to have people really engage with a lived experience, because I can talk at you all day about my lived experience, and it's going to be very difficult for a lot of people to really listen in an intimate way where they can really glean anything from that. And so I thought that it would be cool. How cool would it be that we're actually be able to use some of these technologies in a way that would allow us to immerse ourselves in other people's experiences, people that we wouldn't even consider having a conversation with, but actually walking a mile in their shoes. And so when you're doing that, then you're talking about now you're creating a space of understanding, of common understanding. Not to say that I'm going to convince you, but if I can convince you to at least appreciate, how I'm feeling in these certain times, then maybe that we can actually start talking about reparations where we won't have to really deal with this fight over the power struggle. Because what we always lose here is we talk about power dynamics sort of in a vacuum, instead of looking at all these different intersection identities that make us who we are as human beings. So we can look at reparations as a way to really make the society whole again. Because when I started to research after I wrote the article was like how a lot of these commissions fell apart, and most of it fell apart. The 90% of the critique was on the reparations part, because you can do all these actions to get people together. You can create these documents. You can even make them, policy and in some cases law. But if the group that's marginalized and oppressed is not made whole again, then the commission failed.
Wow, I really like the way that you define reparations there in terms of making things whole, because I think often people immediately assume reparations are referring simply to monetary reparations. It actually reminds me of an article I read just last week, and maybe this is something you can tell us more about, Cara. Sorry to spring this on you, but I was reading an article that the Art Gallery of Ontario had recently renamed a painting by Emily Carr that was titled Indian Church. They renamed it Church in Yuquot Village because they thought that the old terminology denigrated and discriminated against the peoples who were represented in the painting. I think that was driven by the curators Wanda Nanabush and Georgiana Ulyarek. So this issue of renaming, and there are more than one museum doing this, going back and re-examining what artifacts or works of art are called, is one example of making things whole. Would you agree?
Well, I think one of the interesting things about that case is, as I understand it, Indian Church was not the name given to the work by the artist. It was a name designated to the work at some point to help with cataloging and inventorying and knowing what the institution has, and then those names start to stick. And I think what we'll probably find is that in the next few years, a lot of institutions will be going and looking at how we describe works in our collections, as well as those what appear to be titles, but have actually been, descriptive titles attributed not by the artist, but by later, records keeping and curation and collections work, and recognizing that it's not always original to the work itself, and so there's an opportunity to see it afresh, to not just go with the status quo, but to look at it again.
So that's a matter of being very conscious of the embedded biases that were built into the way that museums created, described, and cataloged those works to begin with, and being willing to revisit those assumptions.
Absolutely. We see changes in language throughout human history, and museums are no different. So even terms that have changed in meaning. I know one of the terms we often see in older ethnographic records, for example, is the term grotesque. Grotesque has a very different meaning today, and a colloquial meaning as opposed to a formalist or technical meaning. And those meanings can be misread by publics who are accessing our records online or who are in our institutions with materials. And so it behooves us to look at the language we use and understand how language can be part of the reparations Omar is talking about.
Well, that's a great example of something that's actually happening now to contribute to reconciliation. Both of you grounded your stories in real events. You pointed out, Omar, that the Legacy Museum and Memorial actually opened this year after the magazine came out. And Cara, you were talking about the publication of the Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report, which came out in 2015, I believe. Can you think of other examples of things that are happening now that illustrate how museums are beginning to play the roles you describe in your stories of the future?
Sure. In the article, I also referenced the work of the Museum of Impact with Monica Montgomery. It's a mobile social justice museum that does pop-ups, engaging people around being an upstander. The work of Dr. Amber Johnson with the Justice Fleet, who engages people around issues or topics like radical forgiveness. I mean, people don't even put those two words together usually. And she was able to do it in a really engaging way at the AAM in 2017 in St. Louis. But even to talk about what happened before, because what I'm really, sometimes I get a little anxious about this, because I don't like talking about things in in isolation, right? I mean, there's a history of social justice in museums that just didn't start 2 or 3 years ago. You could go from the very beginning, I'm sure, even if you look at the very first efforts to create the National Museum of African American History and Culture, which according to historians started over 102 years ago, up until the point where you can look at pivotal times like the 60s, where in the Smithsonian you had Secretary Ripley help put together or at least support the establishment of the Anacostia Neighborhood Museum, now the Anacostia Community Museum, under the leadership of John Kennard, who was an activist, who was a community activist, a community organizer, leading a Smithsonian museum. That's radical now, and that was 51 years ago. To even the beginning of the Center for Folk Life and Cultural Heritage, which started the same year in '67, and jumping up the street, I-95, maybe a year later to New York, where you look at the establishment of the Studio Museum in Harlem, and then Museo del Barrio. I mean, these things happen as a result of activism. And so this idea of social justice is something that is threaded through the history of these institutions. And I hope that people are not looking at this as an isolated incident. Like, these things have happened for many, many years now. And I think there's a lot of room for us to build on some of the things that are happening now with Brian Stevenson's work, Monica's work, Amber's work, and a lot of the other things that are happening across the board. Even with the current National Museum of African American History and Culture, Lonnie Bunch has said more than one occasion that this is an activist museum. And so I think that there's a lot of room to grow on, and we can kind of build on this synergy to really work towards what I envision in this article.
Yeah, it's good to remember that sometimes it takes a long time for these actions to come to fruition, but we are not working alone, and we're building on a legacy of many other people who have put their efforts towards the same end. Now,
Absolutely.
Kara, it's a shorter time frame, but I note that the Commission's report and call to action came out in 2015. Can you say anything about, in the 3 years since then, what's followed up on those recommendations?
Sure. I think one of the things my students have helped the Canadian Museum Association to do is to conduct a survey of initiatives across the country in libraries, archives, and museums where reconciliation has been a goal. So one of the things we're trying to do is just understand the work that has been done, that is being done, because oftentimes work is happening, but it flies under the radar. At a higher level, the question of what is actually happening already, one of the things we're hearing in Canada is that for us to be living in reconciliation means that we can start locally, and we should start with upholding treaties. One of the things that the Smithsonian does that actually Canada as a nation does not do is uphold the Jay Treaty. And this enables Indigenous students and job candidates to apply for positions, despite this recent American-Canadian boundary determining that some of their communities are in Canada and some are in the States. So enacting treaties and upholding treaties is a really important step. One of the places we see this happening is in Manitoba. There is a program there called We Are All Treaty People, and there have been exhibits around treaties. One of the other things I think is really beautiful is that the Manitoba Museum has a holding room where they care for things on behalf of First Nations families. They do not own them, they do not control them, but they provide a safe place for them, and families set the terms of access. And one of the reasons I think this is important is, Omar raised the term reparations, and I think in recent museum history, the last 20 years, we've been concerned about repatriation. But reparations repatriation is part of reparations, but reparations is more than that. And one of the pieces that really influenced me in thinking about my blog post was this artwork by Tanya Willard. And it's a beautiful basket, and it says, "Give it all away and start again." And I just love this idea and this impetus to return materials to communities so that we can collect now with free and informed consent. with fair economic transactions. And I even propose that maybe we stop thinking about collecting in perpetuity, but in collecting in generations. So we agree that we'll hold things for 4 generations rather than in perpetuity. And then we renegotiate, the care and the keeping of those materials 4 generations down. But I see a generational shift in my students. For example, they start from the position of why wouldn't you repatriate, as opposed to needing to convince them that it's something that museums should do.
I absolutely love that, Kara. And that's what I'm talking about in terms of, truth and reconciliation, using futurism as a framework to kind of be better in the present, because what it ends up being is that we traditionally, at least in the United States, and I would argue probably in other parts of the world, is that we look at these issues as individuals and not as much time on the systemic. And these issues are largely systemic. And what Kara just talked about was a systemic protocol change. This is a paradigm shift. Let's not take these objects and keep them in perpetuity. Let's take them with the express purpose of conserving them for the public and giving them back. That's a paradigm shift, and I think that's the type of thinking that I hope this article and other and Kara's blog post will continue to perpetuate within our field.
Fabulous. I would like to move us to the point where we can take questions from our audience, because I'm sure people will want to pick both your brains about some of your thoughts on these issues. While people are beginning to ask questions via the platform, I will kick it off with a question of my own for each of you, which is, do you have any suggestions about concrete practical steps that museums could take now to contribute to the work of truth and reconciliation here in the U.S. or in Canada or across the globe? Because I'm hoping some listeners are thinking to themselves that this is a future they would like to help create.
One of the things I would love to see us do is to change accreditation expectations, so that the work of reconciliation becomes part of the accreditation process. Otherwise, institutions, because they rely on funding that's tied to accreditation so much, have to engage in priorities from the past of what a museum is and what it should be. And it ties up a lot of their resources and time and commitments. And it leaves especially small and medium-sized institutions little room to be rewarded for extending themselves into the work of reconciliation. So I would love to see us go to those accreditation processes and intervene there.
Yeah, that's great. I think that for me, I think what's really important also is to just try to find the different components of our current structure, our current paradigm, and begin to dismantle it piece by piece. And what I mean by that is, especially around the leadership issue, we have traditionally in most of our organizations a top-down approach. And I think right now, what we promote in our society are leaders who do not care to admit a mistake, who do not care to work collaboratively unless they have complete control, which is really not collaboration. And so what I would really like to see is for us to uplift and privilege those leaders who are humble, who are willing to partner and to build coalitions with as many people as possible to help co-create a society that is much more equitable, with much safer to have dialogues of difference, and to be able to not only do that, but then once we get that leader who is humble, who is not afraid to admit in the public that they're wrong, to actually have a society that will not crucify him or her because of that. right? So I think
Yeah.
it's twofold. This is a synergistic relationship here. We've created this, and so now we have to, as a society, be responsible in how we react to these things. So we want to uplift leaders who are willing to be humble, willing to be wrong about things. But then when they are wrong, we have to give them the opportunity to get things right and not to jump all over them and take an opportunity to take them out. Because then what we just do is we flip the hegemony, and then we're really back in the same place that we were before.
Amen. So I'm seeing some questions coming in from the audience. Let me feed them to both of our guests. Scott Fong from the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library and Museum asks, how is the historical context taken into account when looking at Truth and Reconciliation?
I think in the Canadian context, and Omar also raised the South African Truth and Reconciliation, the historical context was essential in both of those processes. And really the first volumes of the TRC report is providing historical context to Truth and Reconciliation. One of the things we came to understand in Canada is that really the majority of Canadians didn't understand Indian residential schooling. A lot of people didn't really know that it existed. And so, Scott's question might be a slightly different one, which is that question of sort of a relational ethics or ethics in a time when people are, were people acting ethically in their time? But I think actually going and looking at historical context is crucial in the truth part of Truth and Reconciliation for sure. And I think what we often hear from people is that truth is needed before reconciliation. So I don't know that I hope that they are never disentangled.
Yeah, I agree. I think that looking at what's happening in the history recently and even a while back is really crucial for us to kind of build upon what we want to do presently and in the future. I think, the historical context for the United States is really, looking at the institution of slavery, really looking at the genocide that happened with First Nations people, looking at the history of how immigration has been continued to become racialized, and it's been racialized really from the beginning. But now, in this, this new lens with the way media works now, it's just taken a new height, and even that, has invisibilized people. So I think there's a lot of historical context to why we would want to dig into Truth and Reconciliation. There's a lot of things that we have as a result of sort of being, this country of extreme power and privilege that have sort of swept under the rug. And I really believe that as educators, as informal educators in museum spaces, public history sites, memorials, that we have a really large responsibility in shedding light on these issues and creating spaces for difference. Because what I don't want to do is shame somebody because they think a certain way, even if it's the exact opposite way that I think. What I want to do is create safe spaces of dialogue of difference so that somebody can come from another side of the aisle than I can and say something that maybe I think is completely wrong, but at least we have a space where we can dialogue and build, and that way we can kind of rebuild the humanity that has been taken away from us because of this current paradigm.
Yeah, and that kind of space is all too rare today.
Mm-hmm.
So I have 3 questions from Sophie Lippman at the Pulitzer Arts Foundation, and I'm going to jump in and choose one for now. Sophie asks, how can we decolonize lending practices for ancient objects while sharing knowledge when the rightful conservators, and I think by that word in this context she means owners or originators, are contested or are out of power or are no longer alive? So how do we respectfully deal with lending ancient objects when the people who have some moral ownership for them aren't around to weigh in on the issue? That was my own reframing there. I hope it was accurate.
um, that's a great question that I'll be honest with you, I've not given a lot of thought to, but it really convicts me to say a few things. I would say that part of the reason why that's such a difficult question to answer is because we've done such a poor job as a sector in keeping, building and cultivating relationships with the communities that we say that we serve. But if we did that, that wouldn't even be a question. We would be able to talk to people no matter how far away it was, and we would be able to reconnect with those communities that we have taken their objects and use them for our own purposes. But even understanding that's what it is and it's happened and here we are, really, I mean, again, this is coming from a point of leadership. Be humble ourselves and do the due diligence and doing the best that we can to find those communities, those cultures, those specific individuals who those objects belong to. And, some people understand that, well, that's going to take a lot of time, a lot of effort, and a lot of resources. Yes, it is. And just like somebody told me a long time ago, if you have 20 priorities, you have none. And so, but I think you need to make this a priority if this is where we say we want to go.
Right now in our work with RASAC, one of the things we've been encouraged by a very smart man named Alan Corbier, he encouraged us basically to look at all of our decisions and ask ourselves in what ways do they support equality, equity, and empowerment. And in any situation where major research universities are partnering with relatively small First Nations, even when we have the best intentions, there is always the opportunity for things not to be equitable, not to be equal, and for there to be an imbalance in power. And so these are three questions that we're looking to ask ourselves at every decision. Some of the other things we're also looking to do is to put those questions into a bigger context, and we're really being pushed to make sure that our decisions are ethical in terms of caring for the land and for the water, particularly around the Great Lakes, but broadly in the world, and that our decisions can't aggravate climate change if we can at all choose another option. So I think when we're talking about decolonization, often we're encouraged to think locally, but then also to think about what are those larger values of decolonizing that come to play, and can we take that step back and think about, when we're shipping things, what are the materials we're looking at? Is it okay for us to reuse materials, to be sustainable? Can we afford to purchase carbon footprint offsets and those kinds of things?
Yeah. So I see that another question that Sophie asked is, what are futuristic ways of looking at museum education? And I'm going to take a first swing at that and then invite you two to weigh in. Omar, you were pointing out in an earlier answer that for people to tackle issues of reconciliation really requires an accurate understanding of the past. They have to understand the history of how we got where we are today to have a meaningful conversation about where we should go. And that's a very important role for museums to play, is helping build that knowledge. I would say that a similarly important role is helping people have a basic understanding of futures thinking and this strategy of imagining different potential futures, not assuming that the future is inevitable or set, so that when we talk about how we're moving forward, they understand ways of imagining how the world could turn out and use some established skill sets for seeing what they can do to intentionally guide us in one direction for another. This is one reason I think that it's useful for every museum to incorporate a little bit of futurism and futures thinking into their work, because it's a great framework for helping our communities think about what they want to be in 10 or 20 years and giving them specific skill sets for navigating in that direction. Let's see. Here is I'm reading through a whole bunch of comments and questions now, so you, Omar and Kara, feel free to jump in if you see one you particularly want to take. I'm going to scan for a moment to pick another one for us to tackle.
Well, I just want to, while you're looking at that, piggyback on what you're saying about education. I think it's really important that that we do use some of the futurist framework to really guide our education. Because one of the things that I think is great about it is that nobody is at the place where they envision in the future by default, right? I mean, nobody is there. And so it takes away some of this angst that some institutions may have, or like, oh, well, we're so far gone, we're so far away from what we want to be as a museum, it's kind of hopeless. But if we all kind of understand this as a tool and that we're always in constant development, then I think it becomes a little bit less anxious. And I want to really take the time to foreground the work of the museums as a site of social action, a toolkit. In particular, in one of my former responses on this webinar, when it comes to leadership, looking at the chapter that Chris Taylor wrote on inclusive leadership, because it's really important for us to understand that when we're looking at museums as a site of social action, that's a shift. And that is futuristic for most museums, I would say. But you're coming from somewhere, and when you're coming from somewhere is you're coming from what I would call in at least some cases a place where you might refer to as a nervous landscape. So if I walk into a museum, if I walk into a historic site, and I don't see myself represented, or if I see myself represented in the periphery, well, that at the very least gives me some level of nervousness and anxiety. And so how do we take that reality, that lived experience, and advance it to where we now are operating from a place of social action? And I certainly see education playing a primary role in that transition.
Absolutely. I want to acknowledge that we're coming up on 3 p.m. here in the Eastern Time Zone, which is when the webinar is supposed to end. But I also have other questions I know people would like to tackle. And Kara, yes, I'm going to go on to Philippa's next. So I would like to encourage any listeners who can stick with us. We're going to hang out and talk a bit more. So if you need to sign off now, thank you very much for joining us today. But Omar and Kara and I are going to stick around and talk over some of the remaining questions until we work through some of the remarks. So I hope you can stay with us for a few more minutes. Philippa Topper from Museums Aotearoa, hello Philippa, wrote in to say, many museum professionals are actively trying to work more collaboratively, sharing and ceding agency to communities, but many more are afraid or are actually prevented from doing this because of the conservative attitudes and risk aversion of their political and financial masters. How can we convince the powers that be of the need to shift the power balance? So comments or thoughts on that question?
Well, I love that this question came to us from Aotearoa. One of the people whose work I follow and really admire is Paul Tapsell. And in Janet Marcine's edited volume on museum ethics, one of the things he draws attention to is that it is often the case that curators and collection staff and conservators are engaged in this change. And one of the things he draws our attention to is the need to change boards, governing boards, and perspectives of directors. So absolutely this question of how do we get change at the top, not just from the ground up? I don't know that I have a good answer for it, but I love the question. And I try to think of or imagine a world where there perhaps is greater financial stability. And does that, if we have stronger government funding, for example, does that allow greater risk-taking, or are governments themselves risk-averse and they might hold museums back? I wonder if Omar has more experience in terms of this leadership question that he could share light on.
I don't know. I think that sort of talking about governance is really an important issue, and I thank her for that question, because I think, if anything, we need to diversify the portfolio of our revenue, right? I mean, we're getting like what you said, Kara. We have support from our governments, but we also seek support privately. But then, what does that look like? Are we serving the 1% that represents us in the government on the public side, and are we serving the 1% that represents from the private donors who can, in a typical traditional situation, be on a board, a giving board, a fundraising board, or are we really seeking a way to serve the 99% of the public and the 99% of the people who might be able to give privately as a member, maybe as membership? So I'm a strong believer that that organizations should have membership, and the membership should be tiered as a way, not necessarily like to solve all your fiscal woes, but in a way to really engage the community so they feel like they have some skin in the game, they have some ownership, they have some agency, just because they have that membership card. And I think that there's a lot of good that can come with that. I'm not saying it's a perfect model, but I think it really helps museums establish a much more equitable way to form a governance. I've also seen certain museums have a fundraising board and then maybe have an advisory council that's more either entrenched in the community or maybe has more of an academic purview. And I think all of those combined are ways to really diversify who your governance is, because now you don't have this board that's fundraising for you. You have an advisory council of community activists. You have an advisory council of scholars. And then, of course, then the trick would be to try to get those three groups to kind of work synergistically. And if you're able to do that, then I think you might have an opportunity to really give agency to everyone.
Yeah, I agree. On the financial side, it's a question of creating support that actually validates and amplifies the impulse to address these issues. And I think it absolutely is a matter of recruitment and inclusion on both the governing level and the leadership level of museums, because if people who have a personal stake in these issues are filling those positions, it's not a matter of convincing the leadership, it's a matter of following their lead. But that's not easy. We're really working to break out of the traditional conventions of how you recruit members to the governing authority and how you do succession planning for museum leadership.
Absolutely.
Well, any wrap-up thoughts from you, Kara or Omar, or dangling issues you want to address before we log out today? No? Okay.
I just wanted to kind of, in the article, one of the things that I haven't really been able to talk to about much, which I really think is important, is this idea of expanding narratives. In the article, I touched upon it a bit when we talked about what Brian Stevenson is building on with the memorials and the historical markers of lynching, and taking Vincent Valdez's work in his exhibition of Strange Fruit and expanding that narrative to the Mexican Americans who are also victims of lynching as well, and also providing historical markers. I'm a big fan and supporter of using markers to really acknowledge certain spaces as nervous landscapes, because we need to tell the truth about that. And I think sometimes people are averse to that because of, maybe financial reasons and things like that. But I think the more honest that we can be, the more truth that we can shed upon this type of subjugation, the better position we'll be to actually be reconciled, because now we're operating from a point of view where people understand the lived experiences of the past and how those things have legacies for how we live our lives today.
Yeah, how do you take these issues and embody them in the landscape so people encounter them in their everyday life? I was just reading a great article about how Boston is struggling with how to deal with the legacy of Faneuil Hall, which is named after a gentleman who played a role in the slave trade and was himself a slave owner. And what they're talking about apparently is, rather than renaming the hall, putting up a memorial that explains the history. And one element of the memorial was going to be a plaque talking about the slave dealing that took place in that part of Boston. And one of the things that caught my attention was the artist was going to warm up the plaque to be at 98 degrees Fahrenheit at body temperature, so that if people laid their hand on the plaque and felt the body warmth of it, they would remember the humanity of the people who were bought and sold there, which just struck me as a tremendous, tremendous way to evoke emotion and make it real for people standing on that site.
Absolutely. That's powerful.
For me,
well, thank you very much for joining me today. For our listeners, I encourage you to go to the Alliance website where you can download the Museum 2040 report and read Omar's article and the other articles from our museum futurists, to go to the CFM blog where you can read Kara's blog post and other blog posts that investigated that particular future, and to the TrendsWatch 2018 landing page, where we have published the first of our 4 scenarios. We've published Our Bright Future, which is our optimistic take on the world as it may be in 2040. And over the summer, we will be publishing the other 3 scenarios that we write together with a discussion guide for museums. I look forward to your comments on those. I'll be reading them and revising the materials with your input, and we'll be publishing the compiled report as TrendsWatch 2018 in November. Thank you very much, Blackbaud, for hosting this webinar. I appreciate the chance to share this material with the listening audience.